Pope Leo continues to define his vision of synodality, and a new book by a Jesuit purports to expose Catholic fundamentalism in the United States. The Posse, Father Gerald Murray and Robert Royal, are here with analysis. Bishop Athanasius Schneider of Kazakhstan shares his experience on the recent Chartres pilgrimage and how young people are being drawn to traditional Catholicism. And foreign policy expert Dr. Walid Phares discusses rapidly escalating tensions in the Middle East between Israel and Iran. The World Over begins right now.
Now, Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. An important show for you tonight. If you'd like to comment, send me an X post. I'm at Raymond Arroyo and at Arroyo Grande Show on YouTube. During his Pentecost Vigil Mass, Pope Leo expounded further on synodality. A major U.S. archdiocese is buckling under financial concerns and much more. With analysis, I'm joined by the Papal Posse, editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, on set with me, and Father, canon lawyer, priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray. Thank you both for being here, and especially, though, Bob. He gets extra points, Father. He made the trip and sitting on the set with me. See if you can get those numbers up. This is like the communist authorities. We give you social points as we go. I want to start with Pope Leo's Pentecost Vigil Mass, in which he continued to expound on synodality and where his mind is. He mentioned this a number of times. I want to get your reaction. Here's the bite. The word synodality speaks to us of the road ahead. For where there is the Spirit, there is movement, a journey to be made. We are a people on the move. This does not set us apart, but unites us to humanity, like the yeast in the mass of dough that causes it to rise. Father, your thoughts on the Pope's words here. Is synodality evolving under Leo? And how does that compare to Paul VI's vision of bishops, synod of bishops that he created?
Well, it's not clear, Raymond, exactly where Pope Leo wants to take synodality. The fact that he returns to this theme of the church on the move, that we're journeying, that was Pope Francis's analogy for the synod on synodality, that we're, walking together and accompanying. My big question always is, where are we walking and why are we going there? And the important thing to remember, of course, that the synod already exists, and the process was interrupted by Pope Francis's death, but now it's back on track. So a couple of things we're waiting for. One is the expert committee reports, which were due by June, which are going to answer a lot of questions about what exactly the Synod specifically recommends. And then secondly, the Synod decided to not have another Synod in 2028, but rather to have an ecclesial assembly. And it's very vague about what it's going to consist of. Even the Synod office didn't say specifically, but it looks like it's going to be a sort of jamboree, lay people, bishops, clergy, all kind of mixed into three different groups that are all going to be equal. So is that what synodality means, where lay people and priests are on par with the bishops? I hope not, because Paul VI never had that idea. For him, the Synod of Bishops is bishops helping the Pope.
Pope Leo went on, Bob, to say this: God created the world so that we may all live as one. Synodality is the ecclesial name for this. It demands that we each recognize our own poverty, our own riches, that we feel part of the greater whole, apart from which everything withers, even the most original and unique of charisms. Bob, in what sense is synodality now a synonym for unity? I mean, is Pope Leo further muddying the waters here, or is he attempting to clarify what Pope Francis really meant?
Well, look, we're very early on in this pontificate right now, and we know that he's decided that he is going to continue to use that term, synodality. So in some ways, I think his language is clearer about what he intends this to be. In other ways, it kind of continues that vagueness that it's it's everything, and because it's everything, it's also nothing at the same time. I think what we really need to do is to wait and see what he is going to do concretely. Father mentioned, for example, these study groups. They're due this month. We're already midway through June at this point. Is he receiving them? Has he told these people to put them on ice for the time being? So when we begin to see what he's going to do, is he going to receive them? Is he going to publicize them? Is he going to talk about them? I think then we'll have a more concrete idea of what he wants. Now, this general language about, we're all, God intended us all to live together. Of course, that's true. The problem is we don't. And how do we overcome the sinfulness and fallenness of the world? Yes, we have this aspiration toward a unity with others, to be able to dialogue with others.
But I don't recall synodality being the definition of unity in the church.
Yeah, and look, I mean, historically, synodality in the East means kind of a governing body.
Yeah.
So Father is right to bring up, are we going to continue down this path where lay people and ordained clerics are going to be in some kind of vague relationship with one another? It's not democracy, it's not a parliament, but it kind of seems like one, and there are votes taken, and so we need to see some concrete action.
Yeah. Jens, at another point in the homily, Pope Leo had this to say about the Holy Spirit and the breaking down of walls. Quote, "Let us invoke the spirit of love and peace that he may break open borders, break down walls, dispel hatred, and help us to live as children of our one Father who is in heaven. May the strong wind of the Spirit come upon us and within us, open the borders of our hearts, grant us the grace of encounter with God, enlarge the horizons of our love, and sustain our efforts to build a world in which peace reigns." Father, Pope Leo spoke repeatedly about the Holy Spirit opening borders. Given the tensions and the violence, even the riots we're seeing in LA, do you think the Pope was wading into some kind of geopolitical water here, or is this a spiritual analogy?
Probably both. I think given the context of what we're dealing with both in Europe and the United States of mass immigration that's coming in legally into different countries, that, he's speaking about that. And he has spoken about the subject of immigration as cardinal and archbishop, so that's not surprising. The issue, though, of course, the premise, are walls an obstacle to peace or not? And in many ways, walls are a condition of peace. Because unless you have friendly neighbors, like between the U.S. and Canada where there is no wall, you do need a wall. Look at North and South Korea. North Korea invaded South Korea in the early 50s, and they've been threatening to do it ever since. What stops them? The demilitarized zone and the walls. So it's a good idea to have friendly neighbors and to cultivate friendship. But if you have to protect your country from a hostile force, a wall is a good first effort.
You want to comment on that, Bob? I see you nodding.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's the old Robert Frost, good fences make good neighbors.
Yeah.
If you have things defined very well, then people know where they stand, they know where they need to stop, they know where they come together. And also, I think about this, it's just a political non-starter right now. That practically speaking, sure, maybe he's worried that this is going to become an excessively nationalistic movement, and it could in some places. I mean, we've seen it in the past in history. But it simply is the case politically right now that countries have been thrown into crisis by the lack of borders being enforced. The United States maybe even a little less, as bad as it is for us, than most countries, even though it's created problems in all our major cities, New York, Chicago, LA, and whatnot. In Europe, for example, where you get mostly a Muslim illegal immigration coming in, England, France, Germany are all in crisis. Italy, which is a much poorer country than those others, they have to deal with large influxes of people who don't really fit into the culture. Look, you try to deal with this as best you can, but probably the best way to do it was not to allow this clash in the first place by enforcing the borders.
Yeah. Pope Leo did speak specifically about politics when he said this, and I'll get your reactions. Where there is love, there is no room for prejudice, for security zones separating us from our neighbors, for the exclusionary mindset that tragically we now see emerging also in political nationalisms. Bob, your thoughts on this? Are you surprised by the explicitly political tone of Pope Leo's Pentecost homily.
I have to say that I am, because, look, sovereignty is an important concept. Unless we're going to have a one-world government, the world is going to have to be divided up into zones, if you want to call it that. And they're not solely security zones. They're zones in which people live their lives. I mean, you don't want people walking into your house. Your house is, in a sense, a zone in which you live your life, and you can have a predictable life. And the same is true of political organizations, states, individual states like the 50 states that we have in the United States, the individual nationalist states. They can become a problem, as they did before World War II. But at the same time, they are natural human formations. You can't just live in an open world in which everybody is open to everything. I think that he's gone even a step further than Francis did in this regard of talking about nationalities as almost being somehow sinful, or at least something less than ideal.
Yeah. Father, the Pope does speak at length about the strength of the Holy Spirit, the hope of Jesus Christ. But there's this political message in between as well. I think he's referring here to Gaza, first and foremost. But anytime you talk about nationalism and borders, it's open to interpretation.
No, it's true. And, the use of the word exclusion and inclusion, sad to say, it's part of a woke ideology in which we know which good. Inclusion is good, exclusion is bad, but it's never applied across the board, because the woke crowd never includes conservatives or serious Christians, serious Jews. All of them are excluded in the woke world because they don't go along with this one ideology, which, as Bob said, it is geared toward a one world government, no borders, no laws that are specific to nations. But this is a natural formation, and it's true. We do exclude some people. People in prison are excluded from walking the streets for a reason, because they've been found culpable in a court of law of violating the civil pact that people get along. So exclusion in and of itself has a value when applied properly. But the goal, of course, in the church is the inclusion of everyone in the mystical body of Christ. And that's an admirable goal, and that's a work of the Holy Spirit that the church carries out.
I want to move on. Since we last spoke, the restrictions placed on the traditional Latin Mass by Charlotte Bishop Michael Martin have been paused by the aforementioned bishop. This is to align with an October 2nd deadline by the Vatican for compliance with Pope Francis's Traditionis Custodes that would limit the spread and the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass. The pause certainly comes on the heels of a firestorm of negative reaction regarding the draconian restrictions originally placed by Bishop Martin. Your thoughts on this turnabout? Father, I'll start with you, then Bob. We also learned of a recent meeting prior to Martin's temporary reprieve with Cardinal Arthur Roche, the head of the Dicastery for Divine Worship. He's no fan of the TLM. What do you think happened at that meeting?
Well, I'm not sure, so speculation is simply be worth whatever speculation is worth. I can say this, though. What is good is that Bishop Martin postponed the banishing of the Latin Mass from different parishes where it's been going on very successfully for a number of years. And in his communication, he also said that if the Holy See in the interim between now and October makes any changes to the provisions of Traditionis Custodes, of course, the Diocese of Charlotte will go along with that. Now, that statement may be motivated by knowledge that something's going to happen. It may not, but certainly it's a wise attitude. And I think Pope Leo would understand, I think, instinctively as an American, that compromise when you have clashes would benefit both sides. Because why in the world should we persist in a policy of evicting people from churches simply because of the form of the Mass that they like, which form of the Mass was celebrated in the boyhood of our current Pope, born in 1955. So when he went to his first Mass with his parents, it was a Latin Mass. Well, now he's Pope. I mean, did the Latin Mass an obstacle to the Christian life and his family? Of course not. Yeah. So it's not an obstacle. It's a good thing.
Yeah, Bob, I think part of the outrage was you have people who have been celebrating Mass in these communities, the old Mass, for many, many years. Suddenly they're thrown from their parishes, sent to one chapel that's currently under reconstruction to accommodate the entire diocese of people who love this Mass. That seems a bridge too far.
Yeah, and that chapel is 5,000 square feet, which is not a big
Wow.
area to accommodate a large group of people. Look, I've been talking with people who know that diocese well. They say that if you go to the seminary down there, it's really very much Latin oriented. The people seem to have gotten along. A lot of people have kind of written memoirs about how they've lived their lives there. You can always find a few extremists, in a group of any kind. And so when Bishop Martin came in, he just seemed to ignore all that. I mean, here we are, we're talking about synodality and listening to people and dialogue.
Unity.
And at the same time, you want to talk about exclusion, who's being excluded and sent to this, this faraway chapel. I always come back to Benedict's ideas about this. Benedict talked about mutual enrichment.
Yeah.
He also talked about tolerating the largest diversity that the tradition, the authentic Orthodox tradition, will allow. He said that historically, people have mishandled these divisions in the church by trying to impose a unity where you could have a legitimate diversity within a larger unity. And I think that that's what ought to be happening down there. We'll see. I mean, I would like to think that this little teaser that maybe the rules will change by October. I still don't like that deadline is hanging out.
Yeah, I don't either. And again, it's just a temporary pause. And as you said, if the Pope defines synodality as unity, and he's claiming, as he did in his homily, that it is national distinctions and wanting to put up barriers, that those are the causes of disunity. Here you have people of a common faith. I mean, we have Byzantine rites, we have Maronite rites, we have Greek Catholic rites. All of those exist. No one's having a war. We're unified in that. That is appropriate diversity. Yeah. And one would hope he gets and sees the sense of that and maybe moves on. We'll talk about that in a minute. Following Bishop Martin's original restrictions, he also had he was joined by the new Archbishop of Detroit, who imposed his own restrictions, ceasing the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass after July 1st. So far, this order has not been rescinded. Father, the controversies over this further restrictions on a perfectly legitimate and licit form of Catholic liturgy are clearly not going away. Will Pope Leo be forced to rule on this?
I don't think it'd be forced because he's the Roman pontiff, but I think he will see the wisdom that would come from calling together the different camps in the church and having a discussion and, really expressing why people are afraid of the old Mass and why people think that only the new Mass should be allowed. I think that would be a very fruitful decision on his part. If we want to talk about synodality, accompaniment of people who are being thrown out of their parishes should start with listening to them and taking seriously their arguments. And, I think the Latin Mass is beautiful. I've celebrated it many, many times. I can see no logic for the position that having the traditional Latin Mass in a diocesan parish church harms the unity of the faith and leads people astray. I think that assertion is false, in my opinion. And unfortunately, Pope Francis was of that mind because he viewed having the Latin Mass as something needing to be done away with. Yeah. So I'd like we address those premises and conditions, and then, the Pope arrived at, I think, a good decision to benefit both sides.
Yeah, Pope Francis believed that this was essentially grandstanding by holding on to the old rite and a protest against the new rite. That's how he framed it. That's how he saw it. Does this moment demand clarity and an intervention by the Pope?
I really don't see how he's going to be able to avoid it. I mean, we had this rather harsh, regarding of people as backwardists. I mean, using a term for a Pope using a term like that for some of the most passionate believers in the Catholic Church, I think harmed. It harmed him as much as it harmed the people that he was trying to restrict. Yeah. But look, this is going to be a very delicate dance that Pope Leo is going to have to go through because on the one hand, it's very clear that he is portraying himself as in continuity with Francis, that he wants to continue in the general direction that Francis took, but he's going to bump up against some obstacles along the way. And the only thing I can see him doing is some sort of compromise by which he will kind of bring back what Benedict wanted, but maybe with other language so that it won't be immediately evident that somehow he is contradicting the guy who preceded him. I don't know how he's going to do that. It's going to take some fancy footwork, but I don't know how he's going to be able
Pope
to avoid
Francis
it.
contradicted the guy who preceded him. So, I mean, there is an establishment of this and a pattern. I don't say it's a good one. I think it's very bad, frankly, to not maintain that continuity. But when you rupture the continuity with all that went before, you've got to repair that breach, it seems to me. Gents, once again, we should mention Vatican II and what was actually called for by the Council. Latin was never intended to be banished from the liturgy. Far from it. Magdalen College writer-in-residence Anthony Esselin wrote an eloquent piece this week in the National Catholic Register titled, "Latin Belongs in the Liturgy." Father, weren't the liturgy wars already fought and won under JP2 and Benedict, not to mention Mother Angelica? Why does it seem like it's 1970 all over again?
Well, Pope Francis was of the opinion that those attached to the traditional rites of the Church, which included the Latin language, were somehow backwardist, as Bob just quoted, and other deprecatory names given to them, and also implying that they had psychological insecurities that were seeking refuge in these fixed institutions. I think that's a very unkind and inaccurate way of characterizing people. Latin is the historical language of the Catholic Church, of the Latin Rite of the Catholic Church, which is the largest rite in the Church. And it's the law, the language of canon law. All these great theologians, Augustine, Aquinas, they all wrote in Latin. We can't toss aside Latin as saying that was good then, not now. It's always good. Yeah. And then let's go to the chant, Gregorian chant. Remember a few years ago, the monks in Silos in Spain produced a Gregorian chant CD when they produced CDs, and it was a worldwide hit.
Yeah, and the monks of Norcia followed up, did the same thing.
The monks of Norcia, and look, the Gregorian chant and the Latin language represent vocal mysticism based on words of God taken from the Scripture. Yeah. What's wrong with any of that? Nothing's wrong with it.
No, it's part of our ancient tradition. Bob, it seems the spirit of Vatican II just won't go away. Not the letter, the spirit.
Yeah, a certain interpretation of the spirit for sure, because certainly when we're talking about inclusion, this is something that's not going to be included, even though it's a deep part of our faith. Look, Leo, in one of his first interactions with people, talked to the Eastern Rite churches and talked about that mysticism that Father was just talking about, and invited them to bring that in, and in fact talked about how he didn't want to see Latin parishes in the West to denigrate what came to us from the East, the Greek East and the Orthodox East. How is it any different that we have a form of the liturgy that was valid for 500 years after Trent? We have a form of the liturgy, even with elements going back further than that could be tolerated the way that there are, as you were saying earlier, Greek Catholics and others. And on top of it, we see that young people who are really at sea in our society. I mean, our society is without authorities. That the usual points of reference, whether it's in government, in business, in economics, in the universities, they find themselves not believing any of the usual authorities, and they're looking for an anchor somewhere. And lots of them are coming into the church precisely because they find it in this Latin liturgy. You can't ignore that dynamic. No. That is a living, growing part that the Spirit, I think, is inspiring.
Yeah, this is a good transition to another story I have to get to. A Boston College Jesuit theologian, Father Mark Massa, has written a new book called Catholic Fundamentalism in America. In it, he takes to task a number of figures and movements in the American Catholic scene who he says have fought against modernizing trends in the American church and American culture. Here's a sample from a chapter titled The Old-Time Religion in Alabama. Within very short order, EWTN, this is the quote, became one of the most powerful voices for American conservatism in both its political and cultural forms, as well as for traditionalist Catholicism, to some extent offering a much more accessible and plain-spoken version of the kind of culture warrior stance of higher-brow Catholic media voices like First Things and Crisis magazines. Charles Chaput, sometimes Archbishop of Philadelphia, and himself a culture warrior of impeccable credentials who served on EWTN's Board of Governors, famously noted how Mother Angelica's rhetorical style variously described as plain-spoken or unlettered, depending on one's viewpoint, succeeded at a task that the nation's bishops themselves couldn't achieve. Father, I'll start with you. This Father Massa lumps in schismatic groups, Catholic magazines, church militant, and EWTN and Mother Angelica in the same pot. Your take on those included, and the Catholic fundamentalist label, Father, is the upholding of traditional Catholicism just a dog whistle for Catholic fundamentalism?
Well, of course, Catholic fundamentalism is a slam word. It's associated with Protestant fundamentalism, which is an enemy of liberal Protestantism. But fundamentalism in the Catholic Church is a way to denigrate those who remain faithful to the doctrine of the Church and to the teaching, for instance, found in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. I'd like to ask Father Massa, is it fundamentalistic to believe everything that's written in the Catechism of the Catholic Church? Because if it's not fundamentalistic, what is it? Well, that's what we call steadfast in faith. And I would challenge him to cite anything on this network or in those magazines that he cited which contradicts what the Catechism of the Catholic Church teaches. It doesn't. Now, the problem is, of course, he lives in a world that's been described as fluid modernity. You know, the Boston College theology department is quite liberal. They are in favor of changing doctrines of the faith. They sponsor conferences in that regard.
Yeah.
And they label, for instance, not ordaining women for them is labeled a violation of human rights. That's how they speak about it. They have no reference to the will of God, Jesus expressed through his actions and words. So in other words, for them, there's a menu of items that they haven't been able to order from the restaurant in the Vatican, so to speak, to get it on the menu. And anyone says, no, they shouldn't even be on the menu. We're fundamentalists because we don't believe in women's ordination and the like.
Yeah, well, this is where the majority of Catholics in those pews, this is what they hold dear. And if he doesn't like some of the people referenced in that pamphlet of a book he wrote, he's going to hate St. Paul and St. Peter. But I have to get to this. This is another taste of this. Really, it's an exaggerated pamphlet of a book. Tell me if this sounds a bit familiar to you, gents. Quote, "But even after Mother Angelica's retirement into monastic seclusion in 2001, EWTN continued its on-air denunciation of liberals in the Church, arguably in an even more unnuanced style with Mother Angelica no longer on the scene. Indeed, the network's increasingly strident criticism of the Pope seemed quite consciously presented to undermine the collegiality that Francis was trying to establish in the Church. And the figure who emerged as the chief liberal hunter in EWTN's programming was Arroyo, who gathered a group around him that he himself labeled the Papal Posse." Bob, you're targeted. This is it. It's over. Father Massa has called you out. Your reaction to that? I mean, what's this liberal hunter stuff? Where is that? I wish we had that kind of posse. We don't.
You're the chief liberal hunter, Raymond.
That's
Sarah,
me.
you could wear that around your neck.
I rarely even use the term. Even on Fox, I don't use that term. You know why? It puts people in a box that I think they're not necessarily refined to. I hate the ideological split. It's not ideological, it's foundational.
Yeah.
Well, what do you believe?
Listen, actually what I was going to say is there's nothing wrong with fundamentals. As Father said, the Protestant fundamentalist movement, which started at the beginning of the 20th century, did so because liberal Protestantism was beginning to deny the virgin birth, the divinity of Christ, death on the cross, I mean, all those fundamental things that every Christian, every real Christian ought to believe.
Right.
And so there's nothing wrong with fundamentals. Obviously, if it becomes a kind of an ideology, that turns into something else. This book is so poorly put together. I read that section and I laughed when I read about you. But he seems to believe on the basis of, I don't know what. I think he mentions that he did a quick survey on YouTube. And he thinks that there's a group called the Papal Posse, not the three of us, but it includes Cardinal Burke, Cardinal Mueller, and others. If you look around the same passage, you'll see that it's a myriad group of malefactors. It's not just the Three Musketeers.
The Posse lives free in their mind, and it's getting bigger.
Yeah, so even just in terms of accurately representing who and what we are. Father rightly says, when you're sitting at Boston College Theology Department as a Jesuit theologian, maybe the world that you think of as fundamentalist is not quite as extremist to other people as
No.
you seem to find it
And let
to
me
be.
tell you, Mother Angelica was a lot more fire-breathing than I've ever been. Ever. Just for the record. And any of us. Mother was, but she had the credibility to do that. She was a contemplative who spent hours before the Blessed Sacrament. She ran her religious community. She was a deeply committed sister in consecrated life. And the fullness of everything that she gathered in that contemplation is what the audience saw a little bit of. And when she turned on the fireworks, she only did it on rare occasions, but when she did it, Katie barred the door. Anyway, the book, this is amazing. This book by Father Massa was presented recently to Pope Leo. We have the picture of it by a Monsignor Liam Bergen, who I guess is a confrere. It's a nice photo, but your thoughts on the timing of this, Father? Do you think Pope Leo shares this Jesuit disdain for Catholic traditions?
I hope not. I don't think he's given any indication of that.
No,
and I
agree.
certainly, the first thing we heard about Pope Leo was he's a good listener.
Yeah.
So, you know, when you start hurling these slam word, disqualifying obloquies against priests and laymen who comment on the life of the church, you're revealing your weak hand. Because what you really need to be doing is examining the propositions that we defend on this air, and then refuting, showing us how we're wrong. They never do that.
Yeah.
Instead, they get into this mode, as you say, Bob, that there's some kind of conspiracy out there based on, you know, a wrong approach to Catholicism. This isn't the case. I've been a priest 40 years now. In the seminary, we had the same discussions going on. The moral theology that was being presented after Vatican II was a complete betrayal of the Catholic moral theology taught always. And yet we're supposed to stand by and say, I guess you're right. Maybe Humanae Vitae was a mistake, you know. Maybe we shouldn't, you know, go after things that Jesus Christ himself did, such as when he said, if a man divorces his wife and marries another, he commits adultery. We shouldn't talk about that anymore. No. This network produces, by the way, why is it successful? As you just said, Mother Angelica was a faithful Catholic and people believed that she was.
Yes.
They saw it.
Yeah.
That's why people like this network. This network presents Catholicism, not the latest theory du jour of theologians who find the New Testament an obstacle to their goals.
Yeah. Yeah, and then look, and all we've done here is tried to clarify what's happening. And frankly, I am thrilled, I feel honored that the audience has let us take them through the chaos and confusion that we've all lived through. Look, it was a great blessing for us to be able to do that and to bring it into your homes, into your lives. And I've heard from countless people, thank you all. It was a leveler for me. It calmed me because I knew I hadn't lost my mind or my faith. And it kept people in the faith. So, Father Massa, put that in your second edition, if there is one. Here is, in the United States, a major archdiocese is facing a $50 million deficit. That's $10 million a year in the last 5. The Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. has plans to eliminate 30 job positions in the next week, according to the June 5th memo sent out next few weeks, according to a June 5th memo sent out to archdiocesan staff. The brand new Archbishop of Washington, Cardinal Robert McElroy, called the Archdiocese's financial woes crippling economic challenges to be faced in order to balance the budget by July 1st. Bob, McElroy attributes the financial issues to the COVID pandemic, the McCarrick scandal, as well as the slow U.S. economy. Your thoughts on this news, and where was McElroy's predecessor, Cardinal Wilton Gregory? Why didn't he address this economic emergency?
Yeah, you know, I have asked some friends of mine who know money and know diocesan finances and that sort of thing, and they're very puzzled about this because according to the news reports that we've seen, up until last December, which is to say virtually on the eve of the arrival of Cardinal McElroy, no one had mentioned anything about this $10 million a year deficit for 5 years. So suddenly this comes out of nowhere. It's not unusual the diocese go into bankruptcy these days, often because of abuse payouts. There are other things. I live in the Arlington Diocese, which is just across the river here from Washington. We don't seem to have anything like that. So whatever COVID effect there is, it may be comparing apples and oranges because this is a city, and Arlington is a much more spread out part of Northern Virginia. Yeah. But it just seems odd to me that those are the excuses. Sure, the McElroy, the McCarrick disaster must have discouraged a lot of donors here in Washington, D.C. But for this to go on for 4 or 5 years with no one hearing anything about it, and suddenly a new man comes in, and he probably sent some accountants in to look at what the finances were like, and suddenly this massive $50 million deficit exists. It's going to be very hard to dig out of this hole, even by firing large numbers of people.
Father, I've got a minute left. You said it in the last segment about faith, the average faith of Catholic people. Is that what's to account for this drop in donations and financial solvency of some of these archdioceses? Is it a reaction to the people not being fed what they came for, or is it just a fallout of the sex abuse settlements?
Well, it's partially that. It's also partially just the declining mass attendance percentage among Catholics, which is noted throughout the country. Let's also remind ourselves the Archdiocese of Washington is a rather small archdiocese population-wise, and it had a large bureaucracy, and obviously they were dipping into savings over the last 5 years rather than make more cuts or do fundraising. So I think Cardinal McElroy was forced to act because he encountered a situation which can't go on. Now, the real question we have to all ask ourselves is, what is the purpose of a diocesan bureaucracy? And it's essentially works of pastoral care, education, and charity. So those are 3 main items that have to be looked at. And that's where you have to convince the people, look, the money you send us is not being spent on endless series of secretaries and administrators, but rather on delivering pastoral, educational, and charitable services. If you do that, you'll be able to raise money. But the first thing you got to do, stop losing $10 million a year, which you're financing out of your savings, because your savings are going to evaporate.
Father Gerald Murray, Robert Royal, we will catch up with you on the podcast. I wanted to get to the Chinese bishop appointed by Pope Leo, also the Rupnik art pulled back. We will get into that on the podcast this week at Arroyo Grande. Thank you both for being here. For commentary from Robert Royal and Father Gerald Murray, visit thecatholicthing.org. Thank you both. He is the auxiliary bishop of Astana, Kazakhstan, and a well-known defender of traditional church teaching. He joins me this evening to share his experience on the 43rd Annual Chartres Pilgrimage and what he believes continues to draw young people to traditional Catholicism. Your Excellency, Bishop Athanasius Schneider, welcome back to the program. The annual pilgrimage from Paris to Chartres concluded on June 9th. It drew over 19,000 pilgrims this year, the largest attendance in the history of the event. You were there for the pilgrimage. You celebrated Mass on Sunday at Chartres, and this event continues to draw mostly young people. The average age of the attendees is 20. Your thoughts on what you encountered there?
Yes, I was a witness of the beauty of the Catholic faith, of the joyfulness of the Catholic faith, and all these slogans which we could hear by some clerics, that those who are attached to the traditional Latin Mass, this is all rigid or outmoded, and it's not true. The reality is saying the contrary. I would invite really many bishops or clerics who are hostile against those Catholics who love the tradition of the Church of all times, who love the Mass of the saints, to participate there. They would be moved. You cannot be indifferent when you see children. I was walking 1 hour with different groups of children through the fields. I was moved to tears to see how joyful are these children and or work also with adolescents and young people. There is nothing which can be criticized in some way. It's only edifying. And so I hope that this experience exactly attracts these numbers. This year, as you mentioned, it was the most high
Yeah.
participation in all history of 40 years.
Yeah. I want you to react to and expound on something you said in your homily on Sunday. You said the traditional rite of the Holy Mass is the rite that is always new, always up to date, never old hat or outmoded. Now, Your Excellency, many critics of the old Roman rite, the traditional Latin Mass, they say this is all nostalgia. But for so many of these young people, they weren't even born when this rite was in wide use. Why do you think young people are drawn to this particular rite of the Church? And what did they tell you when you were there in Chartres?
Exactly. Because this form of the Mass, which these children, adolescents, young people witnessed every day during the pilgrimage, this moved them, they attracted them. And so, because it is beauty, it is holiness, the rite itself spreads an atmosphere of mystery, of holiness, which is by itself attracts because it transmits in a special manner the presence of God. And our soul is have thirst to God and to the mystery. God is mystery. God is not something intellectual, only abstract. He is a living mystery, a presence. And therefore, it's attracting these children, these people, and also because the children have a pure soul and are more sensible for the sacredness. And I was observing in the Mass I celebrated on Pentecost, there were even 20,000 people. They came from Paris even for the Sunday Mass, for the Pentecost in this open air area. And with such a crowd, I was walking through them to the altar. I was seeing the people were kneeling in the earth, children and all, recollected, prayerful.
Yeah.
And this is what this rite transmits.
Yeah. Your Excellency, I only have 1 minute left, but since Pope Leo was elected on May 8th, we have been in the process of getting to know the new Pope, the first American Pope. Bishop Schneider, what is your first impression of the Holy Father? And do you think he will rule in favor or against the traditional Latin Mass after Pope Francis's legislation tried to stamp it out?
I hope he will be in favor because he, for the first time in 40 years, since the Chartres Pilgrimage existed, he sent a message to the pilgrims through the Bishop of Chartres. Pope Leo XIV said, I pray for every participant of the pilgrimage. And never before him a pope sent a greeting to the pilgrims of Chartres. This is a good and positive sign. And so therefore we can be hopeful, and we thank Pope Leo for this attention to the pilgrimage of Chartres, to the children, to the young families, and all the participants. And I hope that Pope Leo could open the door wide for this treasure of the Church, of the saints, and of all what we have known in the Church history,
Bishop,
the treasure of.
It was a beautiful pilgrimage, and your Mass was lovely. I saw, excerpts of it, and as well as the homily. It was very moving, and I encourage everybody to go read it and watch it. Bishop Athanasius Schneider, we will leave it there. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
This week on the Arroyo Grande podcast, I talked with radio host Tim Conway Jr. He shared some never-before-heard stories about life with his legendary father, Tim Conway, how important humor is to a family and to fatherhood. It's a Father's Day edition of Arroyo Grande. Take a look. Tell me about those Carol Burnett years. Obviously, he was a star long before that. I mean, McHale's Navy, and he had done a string of television. He was all over television. But the Carol Burnett Show, which he was a guest star, never a regular player.
He wasn't regular until later on, the last 3 years.
But he was practically the star of the show.
Right,
with Carol.
He was a guest almost every week.
Why did that work? I know you knew her too. She would come in and out of the house.
I think it worked because they all had the same sense of humor. Harvey, Carol, Lyle, Vicky, and my dad. Where they all worked clean, and they all just, it was one big family. And he used to just love breaking Harvey Korman up. Here's a quick story.
Yeah.
There's a sister station in Los Angeles called KLAC, and they do a benefit every year for Paralyzed Veterans of America. Great charity. So James Worthy, one of the stars of the Lakers, comes in, and I'm never starstruck with anybody. So I go to James Worthy, I say, hey, I just want to meet you. And he says, what's your name? I told him, he said, are you any relation to Tim Conway? I said, yeah. And he stops and he says, I've won championships in high school. I won championships in college. I won championships in the pros. I made more money than I could ever spend. And I would give all of it away. I get goosebumps, so I'd tell the story.
Gosh.
I give all of it away for 10 more minutes in North Carolina with my grandmother watching the Carol Burnett Show.
Oh, my God.
How great is that?
The entire Arroyo Grande interview with Tim Conway Jr. is on YouTube at Arroyo Grande Show, or wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple, iHeart. Be sure to check it out and subscribe so you don't miss an Arroyo Grande show. And we have a new Prayerful Posse episode that drops Friday. Visit RaymondArroyo.com for all the links. Tensions in the Middle East between Israel and Iran are on the rise. Will Israel make a move on Iran's nuclear installations? With analysis, I'm joined by foreign policy expert, co-host of the War and Freedom podcast, Dr. Walid Phares. Walid, thank you for being here. Iran announced that it successfully test-fired an advanced missile equipped with 2-ton warheads, significantly intensifying its war machine amid nuclear negotiations with the United States and threats of attacks on U.S. military installations. At the same time, Israel is considering military action against Iran with or without U.S. support. In a recent CBS report, multiple Israeli officials have said they are fully ready to launch an operation into Iran. Walid, your thoughts on this developing powder keg? What are you hearing?
It is exactly what you said, a powder keg, but let's look at two components very quickly. What brought to my attention this analysis is what the Islamic regime in Iran is saying. They are sitting at the table and negotiating for peace, negotiating for ending the crisis, and informing the American public that they have missiles that they could launch anywhere, anytime, any place in the Middle East against American forces. What would that tell you about their intention? But putting this aside, the Israelis cannot risk. We can. We are very far. We have also a strategic response.
Yeah.
If the Israelis feel that the regime is, triggering or about to trigger, they're going to conduct their strikes by themselves. Now they are in line with the Trump administration. There are negotiations, but if Tehran decides to go straight against Israel, the Israelis will counter.
Also this week, the U.S. is evacuating non-essential staff from embassies in Baghdad, families and military personnel from several bases in the Persian Gulf, amid growing concerns about the security in the Middle East in anticipation of this possible strike by Iran or Israel on nuclear centers. Walid, what do we know about this situation? Is an Israeli strike on Iran's nuke capability inevitable? And what does that look like?
It is inevitable if basically the regime decides to let go of the peace process with the United States and to conduct those strikes, as I said. But my concern now is really the intention of the regime with regard to their talks with us. I mean, we are withdrawing staff of all these embassies, and we are sitting with them negotiating. There is something not clear about this matter, and I'm sure that the Trump administration at one point is going to make a decision with regard to Iran.
President Trump has been pushing hard for a ceasefire. He visited the Middle East in May. He hosted that GCC summit with Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain. Walid, what have been the results of these personal interactions by the president? Any progress at all?
Well, first of all, he got to America trillions of dollars. Now, of course, I trust the Emirates, I trust the Saudis. I have some concerns about the Qatari trillion, but of course, the president must have more information than us. But on the other hand, other than the financial, which is and was very good, it's what will happen on the ground. Will this basically help us in Gaza? Will this help us in Syria? Only time will tell in the next few weeks and months.
But you don't see, right now, you don't see any fruit of that, especially concerning Hamas and Gaza. No progress really has been made there. Seems like a stalemate.
It's what we see on the ground, Raymond. Yes, of course, at the end of the day, Hamas has been defeated strategically. It's what the outcome is going to look like. The Israelis wants to end that fight on the ground and free how many hostages they have. Our administration wants to see if we have a chance to get at least the hostages out, and you have those two processes going on. I think that all of these negotiations, from Yemen with the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah is also still an issue, and with Iran or with the regime in Iran directly, it's all controlled at this point in time by Ayatollahs.
At least 5 Palestinians working for the Israel-U.S.-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation were killed. Several were injured after a Hamas gunman allegedly opened fire on a bus, bringing them to one of its distribution hubs in southern Gaza. Waleed, what is the situation in Gaza now? I mean, there have been many cries about you can't get aid in. Well, this is another example of why, perhaps.
That's exactly true. It's an excellent question with regard to Gaza and Hamas. Hamas is disoriented. Hamas is insecure. But Hamas still has a lot of weapons and it has hostages. This is the most dangerous stage in dealing with Hamas. But the most important thing, Hamas fears a revolution against its own power. It's not just the Israeli strikes. They can survive as long as Israel is not conducting a land operation, a final land operation. But look at the videos from 2 weeks ago. Thousands of Gazans basically demonstrating against Hamas. This is where I see the hope, is that the population in Gaza, Palestinian Gazan population, is now turned against Hamas, but they don't have any way to protect themselves. That's why Hamas may be shooting against international humanitarian organizations, fearing that the opposition will link up with them. It's like a huge jail, and Hamas basically is controlling that.
The United Nations General Assembly will vote this week on a draft resolution that demands an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire of the war in Gaza, after the United States vetoed a similar effort in the last Security Council meeting. Waleed, this war has been going on for a good long time now. Casualties continue to mount. Is there any possibility for a ceasefire?
Of course, there is a possibility for any ceasefire, mostly between Israel, Hamas, and all those involved, the minute Hamas accept to let go of its power. I mean, the UAE and indirectly Saudi Arabia have prepared already the alternative to Hamas. Hamas knows that. Iran's regime is not happy with that. There will be a different regime. Israel can end this war in few weeks, but to do so, they have to go in. And now we have negotiations and talks with Hamas. Hamas uses the talks to stretch as much as they can. What really is happening behind that is the outcome of the US-Iran regime negotiations. Because just imagine, or just try to imagine, that there is a big commander of all these fronts sitting in Tehran. That's Ayatollah Khamenei. And they are telling the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, other militias in Iraq what to do or not to do. So Gaza war is not just in Gaza. It's all over the Middle East.
As we've talked about for years, in our last 2 minutes, Waleed, religious minorities in the Middle East, they're always caught in the crossfire between Israel and Hamas. What's the state of those religious minorities in Syria in particular? Christians and Alawis, Druze, Kurds, they're all suffering.
Big question for many people in the U.S., actually for a majority in our public. They're very sensitive, first of all, to the persecution of Christians in the Middle East in general. You and I had so many discussions about that. I remember 2014, 15, with the Assyrians, the Syriacs, the Chaldeans, and of course the other minorities around them. And look what happened to them. It was a genocide. My concern in Syria is that we are going so fast in propping up the current regime, which we have engaged, as far as I know, is the threat against the Christians in the coastal area of Syria. They have had a lot of fatalities. The Alawis have been persecuted actually by the jihadists, and of course in the south, the Druze. I don't consider the Kurds as a minority. They have their own institutions and everything. And for that, I have urged the Trump administration. I have even urged Saudi Arabia and others to create a conference whereby the current regime and these minorities will come to grant these minorities. It's not just protection, it's actually rights and freedom and liberties. Yeah. And I hope that would be at the next stage.
The world is watching, Walid, while Los Angeles has erupted into violence for the past week over these protests turned to riots in response to ICE raids in Southern California. We've talked for years about the threat of terrorism coming from across the porous southern border. Does what we're seeing in LA, Walid, the past 7 days, does that reflect that threat, or is this purely a domestic disturbance?
First of all, there is no more purely domestic or international at all meshed up with each other. We've seen what the networks of jihadists or other radicals around the world, from Latin America as well, neo-Marxists, are calling their supporters inside the United States to join what they call is a destabilization of our major cities. Now it's in Los Angeles, it could be in other places. And there is a cadre of these radicals that has been embedded, not from those just now trying to get into the United States. They're in already. You have millions of illegals. Within those illegals, you have thousands of activists, and many among them have been connected to or are connecting themselves to radicals around the world, either Marxists from Latin America or the jihadists. And we see all these keffiyas, we see all these slogans being chanted throughout the United States, first on campus and now on the streets of LA.
Walid, we'll have to leave it there, but we'll catch up with you in the days ahead. Iran, an imperialist republic, and U.S. policy by Dr. Walid Phares is available at bookstores everywhere. Walid, thank you.
Thank you, Raymond.
That is all the time we have for now. Be sure to check us out next week. Until next time, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo. I know.